Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you from my little nutshell of infinite space right here in the wood of the holly. On the other side of this digital divide is a return guest, someone who I am incredibly impressed with and actually quite fond of. Talk about a resume, talk about a legacy, and talk about his own accomplishments. This gentleman is currently a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a former Supreme Court clerk for Justice David Souter. He went to Harvard, he went to Yale. He is a historian, a constitutional scholar, and a damn good novelist. And if you don't know already, he bears one of the most distinguished ancestries imaginable. His ancestors were shapers and architects of the 20th century. He is the great-great-grandson of none other than that rough-riding, trust-busting, big stick-wielding square dealer Teddy, and also more distantly related to that New Dealer who saved capitalism, Franklin Delano. And he also had his own issues with the Supreme Court. So I am so pleased and honored to have him back with me again today. Welcome, Kermit Roosevelt. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me. That's quite an introduction. I appreciate it.
Well, you earned every word of it. So, and I have to say, as a word to the listeners, I have read many of his books, including the most recent one, The Nation That Never Was, which is a really great meditation on a fresh look at our creaky old Constitution. And he's also written some really good novels as well as many papers. And he has special insight about this Supreme Court that is trying to reverse some of the wheels of social progress in history. And just as a general sort of question, how are you feeling about all this?
Well, not good. So I'm not a fan of the current Supreme Court.
Uh-huh.
And in kind of a couple different ways. So one way is I interpret the Constitution differently than they do. I have a different view about what the Constitution means. So I think they're getting some cases wrong. And, you know, different people have different views of the Constitution. One of the things that happens with the Supreme Court is people get put on the court because of their views. So you don't necessarily know how they're going to rule in particular cases. So I think we've been moving closer towards a model where people want to know exactly how the justices are going to rule in particular cases. But it's sort of a predictable consequence of Republican appointments, that you get a court that leans right, you get a court that decides cases more consistently with the vision of the Republican Party. And I wouldn't really complain about that, I think, if the Republicans had been winning presidential elections. But they haven't, right? They've won a minority of the past 8 or 9 presidential elections. So it's a little bit weird that they've got a 6-3 supermajority on the Supreme Court. And I feel like that does make their rulings a little bit more open to question. But then even more, like the thing that I'm really worried about is the possibility that Republicans are winning a minority of presidential elections, but somehow they control the Supreme Court, and it's sort of through luck, it's sort of through partisan hardball, through a bunch of different factors. But then the Supreme Court is going to make it easier for them to win elections going forward. That's what I'm really concerned about. So minority party loses the popular vote in the last 7 of the last 8 presidential elections. Mm. They get control of the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court helps them take over the presidency, helps them take over the rest of the government, and sort of locks everyone in. That's my nightmare scenario.
Well, it sort of happened actually in 2000. The Supreme Court had to weigh in on, the Florida controversy. Ironically, with all these decisions that have come down, whether it's affirmative action, abortion, marriage, and all these rights, the one decision that they had, I guess that might be more alignment, was about the state legislature's capacity to intervene in elections. They actually, I believe, struck that down. Am I right?
They did. So they rejected the independent state legislature theory, at least in its strong form, which is good because the independent state legislature theory, like all of the people who know the history, all of the good constitutional scholars were saying this is crazy, right? This is a bizarre conspiracy theory kind of version of the Constitution that people dreamed up. And it's pretty clear they were doing it for partisan advantage because the idea is give the power to the state legislature. What does that do for you? In a bunch of swing states, the legislature is controlled by Republicans because it's gerrymandered. Mm-hmm. So even though a majority of the voters aren't voting Republican, Republicans control the legislature, and then the Democrats have the statewide office like the governor, but the legislature's in control. If you give the legislature power under this theory, that state's going to go Republican. So it's all like, based on this stupid electoral college system we have. But it was good that the Supreme Court rejected that theory. They didn't totally reject it, right? They did say, in extreme cases, perhaps we'll weigh in. So they left open the possibility that sometime in the future, if they think something strange enough has gone on, they're going to come in and say the state courts have gone too far.
When you look at all these decisions taken in total, you can kind of look at them individually and parse some of the legal arguments. But when you look at it in its totality, what you're seeing is a massive reversal of the social progress that we've enjoyed probably since Brown v. Board of Education. It does look like a concerted effort just to roll back all this stuff. And it's depressing because in my lifetime, born in 56, up until a certain point, we've seen this kind of gradual arc of expansion of liberties, of rights, whether it's in the civil rights, gender, these whole, you feel like, yeah, we're getting better, but it seems, I can't put the date on it, but that has been put into reverse. And the Supreme Court's going one way, and the public really is going in the other way. And I'm just feeling all this incredible tension about that. Just my thought.
Yeah, well, I think you're exactly right. Like that's what's happening, and that's how we should understand it. And we should understand it as part of a series of cycles in American history. And I do think like the American people are getting better over time in terms of our openness to difference, in terms of our belief in equality, in terms of our valuing diversity. We're getting better. And that, puts us on sort of a general upward trend, I think. But every time we move forward, there's a backlash because there are people who are opposed to equality. There are people who are scared of difference, and they push back. And the first time, the really most salient time this happens is the Civil War, right, which obviously moves us towards equality, Reconstruction, which fundamentally changes the society of the South, gives us a functioning multiracial democracy, moves us enormously forward in the direction of equality and inclusivity and so on. And then it's overthrown, right, violently, the redemption of the South, which is an episode in American history that is very poorly taught, very neglected in our schools. But basically, white supremacist terrorists overthrow the integrated governments of the South.
Correct.
They take back control. The Supreme Court kind of helps them. And then until the civil rights movement comes along, we make really no progress on racial equality. So the civil rights movement comes along. What do people call it? They call it the Second Reconstruction. And race is one of the first areas in which there's progress, in the 1950s and Brown and so on. But then the women's movement and sexual orientation, all of that comes along because equality movements tend to move together. And the Second Reconstruction brings us a lot of equality gains. But then there's a backlash, and it's basically exactly the same. There's less white supremacist terrorism, there's less military conflict, because redemption actually takes place through violence. There are battles between white supremacist paramilitaries and the integrated police forces and militias of these southern states. So it's less violent. But I think starting in the 1980s, basically, you've got the Second Redemption. And I put it in the 1980s because I think it's the election of Ronald Reagan. if you look at what Reagan is talking about, it's very much like a neo-Confederate vision. And Reagan says, I'm going to restore the founding. And at first I was like, wait a second, he's kind of being misleading when he's talking about the founding fathers in 1776, because really he's talking about the values of the Redeemers in the 1870s. But then I was like, you know what? Actually, he's kind of got a point, right? Because the founding has a lot in common with the Confederacy when you think about it.
Well, yes, because the founders of the 1700s basically affirmed all these the idea of property rights is extended very clearly right to human beings in the original Constitution. It's one fact. I always think like, well, wait, maybe our country, the founders really weren't all about freedom at all. They were about property rights and the political separation from this mother country. And those property rights get circumscribed only after the Civil War. As a matter of fact, they're enforced, as you know, by Dred Scott. It's like, wait a minute,
yeah.
They're property. Sorry.
Yeah, right. So Dred Scott, right? It's about the sanctity of property, and the property in that case happens to be another person. But that's the whole argument. The whole argument is, gosh, you can't take away property rights like this, and slaves are property just like any other kind of property. It doesn't actually rely on the idea that slavery is specially protected, although it was under the 1787 Constitution. But yeah, it's about property.
And one of the thought I was reading Erwin Chemerinsky, and he actually he quotes you on one of his books, I forget. But
he does?
Yeah,
I'm so happy to hear that.
He takes issue with you on something. I do.
He does. So he disagrees with me?
Something.
Oh, okay.
Well, one of the things, it's not. He quotes you. I wish I could be more clear. I've asked him. He's agreed to do my podcast. I went to Berkeley, but he hasn't done it yet. I'm waiting. But one of the things he does say about the founding document is that to see the Constitution is important, he says in his book, to see it through the lens of the preamble to the Constitution. All men
that's true.
Created equal.
No, but that's the Declaration.
Yeah, the Declaration.
And the thing is, people didn't care about the preamble in 1776. They didn't think it was important. You could read it now and be like, that's the important part, we love it. And I have no argument with that. But don't say that's the founding fathers, because it's not.
Well, what he says basically is that if we see the Constitution through the lens of that, it's basically informing us that it is actually a more liberal document than maybe we were perceived.
So these are Chemerinsky and I think, agree kind of on where we want to go.
Right.
But we have different ideas about how to get there. And I think this is sort of like a fundamental question that recurs in American history. Here you are, you've got a world, it's imperfect. You've got a governing system, it's imperfect. Your Constitution isn't everything you want it to be. What do you do? Do you try to read it in its best light so that you can get as close as you can to what you want? Or do you reject it and make something new? And he seems to be, I think, doing the read it in its best light version.
Right.
And take a look at the Declaration and use it to inform your understanding of the Constitution. I think that's sort of fundamentally wrong historically, because the point of government, according to the Declaration of Independence, is to protect the natural rights of individuals from other individuals. And the Constitution written in 1787 doesn't do that at all. Zero. It has no concern for protecting individuals from other individuals, because it assumes the states are doing that. It just leaves that up to the states. So the Constitution written in 1787, the federal government created in 1787, it's not at all the kind of government described in the Declaration. The idea that the Constitution embodies the values of the Declaration of Independence is like what philosophers call a category mistake. It's just a different type of government. It's a league of independent states. It's not there to protect the natural rights of individuals. This is like a big conceptual error that people make. It does become that kind of government when the United States Army starts protecting formerly enslaved people from their former masters. And that's like 1865, when the U.S. Army gets into the South.
Right. And just as a sidebar about the Revolution, and you mentioned this in your book, the original, this 18th century revolution, was that all the emancipation documents offers were really coming from the British government to the enslaved people at that time. It wasn't coming from the Americans.
Well, yeah, right. So, I mean, if you're thinking about slavery and freedom and the revolution, and you're like, oh, of course, a revolution is a war for freedom. Well, no, not really. Lots of people, tens of thousands of people gained their freedom during the revolution because they escaped from their patriot masters. And then a lot of them joined the British and fought against the Americans. Right. And it's pointed out, like, there were black people fighting with the Americans, which is true. There were 4 times as many black people fighting for the British. But the sort of stunning thing, well, 2 stunning things that I learned while I was working on the book. One is, how did black men enter the military service of the United States? Some of them signed up, right? And some of them were promised freedom if they did. But some of them were there because white men who were supposed to join the Patriot Army were allowed to provide substitutes. So you're like, I'm being drafted, kind of, I don't want to fight, I'm going to provide a substitute. And some people provided enslaved people. They provided their slaves as substitutes. And that's how you get some of the black people fighting for the Americans. And then the other thing is, so we're like, gosh, it's a war, we need more men. One thing that people did was they said, hey, look at the enslaved people, offer them freedom, they'll fight for us. Another thing that they did, South Carolina did this, was they said, let's bribe white men. Let's induce them to join the fight for freedom and liberty. How are we going to do that? We promise to give them slaves if they sign up to fight for the patriot cause, right? After the war, we'll give you more slaves. That's the American Revolution.
Wow. Which, of course, slaves were, up until I don't know when, considered maybe the biggest asset of the United States. What was that great book by the German fellow, and he writes about the Empire of Cotton. He really is just a great book. And of course, you mentioned earlier, just a few moments ago, that the only way we got those amendments was to really, at the point of the Reconstruction amendments, was at the point of the federal sword in southern states. Otherwise, in all likelihood, those amendments would have not happened.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the areas where, like, we're telling the story, but we're not quite getting it right in what I think is a super important way. Because most historians, if you ask them, will say, yeah, like, the Reconstruction amendments were forced through at the point of a bayonet. The southern states, the former Confederate states, were coerced into ratifying the 14th Amendment. But that actually gets it wrong in a really important way, I think. Because if you look at, like, the 13th Amendment, which bans slavery, and you look at the legislatures who voted to ratify that, and you ask, is that what they really wanted? The answer maybe is no, because those legislatures are white Democrats ratifying the 13th Amendment in 1865. And maybe they're not abolitionists. They're probably not. They're probably being forced to do this. They know they have no choice. But look at the legislatures that ratified the 14th Amendment in 1868 and ask, is this what they want? Yes, it is. No one had to twist their arms to make them vote yes on that, because those are racially integrated Republican legislatures. Those are pro-equality legislatures. They want to ratify the 14th Amendment. They're not being forced to do it. So, like, what happened? How did this happen? How did we get these pro-equality, racially integrated legislatures? The answer is Congress destroyed the former Confederate states. So Congress sends the 14th Amendment out to the states for ratification, and it gets rejected. It gets rejected by 10 of the 11 former Confederate states. It gets rejected by Delaware and Maryland, and Ohio and New Jersey try to withdraw their ratifications. The 14th Amendment is not going to be ratified. Primarily, I think, or in large part, because of its birthright citizenship provision. So basically what's happening here is Congress is saying to America, will you accept black people as citizens? And America is saying no. And then in response to that, Congress wipes out the governments of 10 of these former Confederate states. These are the Reconstruction Acts. Congress says no governments exist in these states. They're under military control. And then they build new states. They say, hold constitutional conventions. The formerly enslaved can participate. The former Confederates can't. And that's how you get these new governments. That's how you get these racially integrated legislatures that actually want to ratify the 14th Amendment. So what happened isn't that the old Georgia, the old Florida were forced to ratify. What happened is Congress destroyed those states. Congress made new states that said yes. And there's actually a Supreme Court case about this because the legislatures of Florida, Georgia, and Alabama sued the Secretary of War and said, Congress has destroyed our states. Congress has imposed these new political authorities, and we're suing on behalf of the old states because Congress can't just wipe out state governments. And the Supreme Court said that's a political and not a legal question, and we can't decide it.
Wow. So basically the slave power, the slave political power was expunged and a new majority emerged to ratify. Of course, the 14th Amendment is a big blanket. I often think that it's the Section C should have been applied very clearly against the previous occupant of the White House, but I don't know.
Yeah.
It seems pretty clear when you read it. You don't have to be a legal scholar, I mean, to see that. But but I'm going to fast forward a little bit to the beginning, to the current moment with this affirmative action decision, which ironically uses this great tool of the 14th Amendment to roll back some of this social progress that we've enjoyed with respect to affirmative action. By that is the Equal Protection Clause. It's almost kind of insidious in a way. It's like, look what they did. It's like jujitsu of some sort.
Yeah.
Your thoughts?
Well, it is jujitsu, and like it's a weird thing. It's maybe the most bizarre thing with the 14th Amendment, because here you've got the constitutional provision. What's the point of it? The point of it basically is to prevent us from having a racially stratified society. That's what the 14th Amendment is about. We're saying, we've got the 13th Amendment, slavery is banned. What will the place of the formerly enslaved people be in America? And the southern states are saying they're not going to be citizens. They're going to be a subordinate class. And Congress is saying, no, we're not going to have a racially stratified society. So the idea that this prohibits affirmative action, which is an attempt to avoid a racially stratified society by making sure that there are minority members of, elite schools and elite institutions generally, the idea that affirmative action is prohibited by the 14th Amendment is crazy to me. But I should say it's not inconsistent with the way constitutional adjudication kind of goes, because there are other constitutional provisions also, which are sort of set up initially as a shield for the weak. And then the Supreme Court turns them into a sword for the powerful. And you kind of see this with free speech, where in the early cases, like go back to the 1960s, who's bringing free speech claims? It's the dissenter, like the solitary protester on the street corner. Fast forward to like the 80s up to now, who's bringing free speech cases? It's like the big corporations. It's the people who want to give lots of money to influence elections.
Right.
So suddenly it's the powerful. Exactly the same thing happens with religion and the free exercise clause. And you can see, interestingly, there's sort of a right-left shift on who's a big supporter of free exercise. Because if you go back to the 1960s again, the people bringing these claims are the minority religions who are being forced to do things that are inconsistent with their beliefs, like the Jehovah's Witnesses. The Pledge of Allegiance case is actually a Jehovah's Witness bringing that suit. And like the Native Americans who want to use peyote in religious rituals.
Right.
But fast forward, what's happening? It's mainstream religions, it's Christians who don't want to follow anti-discrimination law, basically. So it's not a shield for them now, it's a sword that they can use to exempt themselves from anti-discrimination law. And basically, what happens is powerful people end up controlling the levers of power. Constitutional rights give you power, powerful people take them over. And the Supreme Court does that.
So it's the aggrieved majority all of a sudden. And of course, this jujitsu is also performed with respect to freedom of speech or the First Amendment with this law that was the person that was refused to create websites for gay marriages, which apparently
the wedding website.
a real it was trumped up and created so that they could run it up the flagpole, as far as I can see.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. It does seem to be kind of a fake dispute.
Mm-hmm.
So there was supposedly some guy named Stuart asked her for a wedding website so that he could marry Michael, but then someone contacted Stuart and he was like, I'm a website designer myself. I don't need anyone designing a website, and also I've been married to a woman for the past 15 years.
Yeah.
So like, it was totally fake.
Right. So what does that mean? It means to me,
well,
you tell me.
Well, so I mean, the court does have rules about when you can bring a suit based on something that you're planning to do that you haven't yet done, if there's a threat that the law is going to be applied against you. And those cases are all inconsistent and result oriented, and people are like, yeah, the court hears the cases it wants to hear when it wants to hear them. And that's kind of what was going on here, which is not totally unusual, I would say. But I do think that maybe the court chose this case because they're kind of advancing religious liberty in terms of freedom to discriminate, but they're doing it through a speech claim, so it doesn't look as much like they're favoring religion. And I think maybe that's why they chose it. And I kind of feel like the agenda-setting power of the court is something that we should be looking at more. There was an opinion piece in the New York Times about this recently by Jeffrey Fisher.
I read it.
Made some really good points.
Yeah.
I think. So like, one, the justices in the majority, the 6-3 majority, get to choose good vehicles. So they can push outcomes they'd like in cases where it's going to arouse the least popular resistance. But then also, sort of even more disturbing, if there are old cases that they don't want to overrule, because if you overrule a decision, people get upset about it, like Dobbs, right?
Right.
They can let lower courts sort of ignore those decisions by just declining to hear the cases. So, there's an old precedent, an old liberal precedent that people don't like. The conservative Fifth Circuit just basically ignores it, and the Supreme Court doesn't take the case. Then the Fifth Circuit's view stands.
Right. So that's exactly, I read that. I think it was in the New York Times, and that's what 6-3 allows for. 6-3 allows for I think if it's 5-4, then
right, because it's 4 votes to grant cert, 4 votes to hear the case. Four justices can make the court hear it. So then the court would have to be like, either we overrule this old precedent and we're doing it openly, and then people get upset, or they'd be like, unfortunately, this can't be squared with our precedent. We reverse. But this way, they can kind of do it under the table,
right?
Which is bad.
It is. I kind of feel like I don't want to say Republicans feel this is a once in a generation moment to ram through as much as they can to set back the clock. And it seems like,
well,
that's what's happening.
It is a once in a generation moment. And I'm sort of glad that you said that, because this is a point that I kind of like to make. It's a once in a generation moment, or even rarer, in terms of how far away we are from what the composition of the court would be if every president appointed 2 justices per 4-year term, which is what equal presidential influence on the Supreme Court would look like. Right. We are 6 justices off that. We should be 6 in the other direction.
Right.
We should have,
if Obama,
should be 6-3 the other way.
Right. Oh, so we should be in a democratic.
We should be a 6-3 Democratic court. Yeah. And when was the last time we were there? It was like it was more than a generation ago, I guess. It was like in the 1970s. We were that far off. And then before that, you have to go back over 100 years, 1857. Guess what? That's the Dred Scott court, right? That's the court.
Taney.
That said, yeah, that's the last time before the 1970s when the court was this far away from where it would have been if every president had equal influence.
So let me ask you this. If each president under your suggestion could get 2, does that mean that you'd have to retire 2, or that the court would expand because they would get 2?
Well, so you could do it and keep this sort of indefinite period of service. The justices stay active until they retire or die. But then you do have the court expanding, which is a little bit weird, and you still have kind of unpredictable consequences when the justices decide to retire or randomly die. So people who've thought about this problem, and I'm one of them, the Biden Supreme Court Reform Commission was one of them, and I've worked with other groups too. Most people say if you want to regularize Supreme Court appointments, you give each president 2 appointments per 4-year term, and then you have each justice have 18 years in active service. And then after that, they're basically retired. Importantly, they are still a Supreme Court justice. They're not removed from the court. That's what makes it possible to do this by statute rather than through a constitutional amendment. But you've got a consistent pool of 9 justices. Maybe it goes up if you don't apply it to justices who are sitting now. Maybe it goes up temporarily. But eventually, you still have a 9-member court.
Oh, I see. Because two, it just works out. Well, is there anything that we can feel optimistic about with respect to this court in this moment, or is it just terrible?
I think it's pretty terrible, honestly. And I don't know, it's hard for me to know what to root for, really, because I do think if they push too far, there's going to be pushback. And I do think that people are more interested in term limits and people are more interested in court expansion. And I should say I support both of those things. I think politically it's a difficult battle, but the Supreme Court helps us, right? Every time they do something more outrageous, the support for those kind of reforms grows. So I almost don't know what I want them to do.
Because they do incite a certain kind of new activism with each one of these decisions.
And so this is what I was talking about, or what we were talking about with they can let the crazy Fifth Circuit get away with it and just not hear the case, and then no one knows what's happened, right? It's the stealth constitutional revolution. This is why it's important that we shine a light on it and let people know what the court is really doing.
Now, in your novel, you wrote very personally about Hugo Black and his love for tennis. And the feeling I got was, wait, these people are actually human beings. It's not the divine right of justices. They have their own foibles and prejudices and things like that. And I wondered, since you spent some time there, is that still going on? Or can those, Sotomayor even talk to, Alito or Thomas? I mean, what do you think goes on in those rooms?
Well, I don't know. I mean, so when I was clerking, there were pretty intense conflicts in terms of what the justices thought about the cases. And the clerks, so my experience was the clerks took it pretty personally. And, if you were the clerk on one case and your justice was writing a majority and some other justice was writing a dissent and they were really going at each other and it was pretty harsh, the clerks felt a sense of conflict, I think. But the justices really didn't. Because the justices understood that they were there for a long time and they needed to get along with each other. And they all believed, I think, that every justice was doing their best and trying to get the right answer and acting in good faith. And Bush v. Gore was maybe a little bit of a turning point on that. And I think that the Dobbs leak also affected the atmosphere there. So I don't have any personal knowledge of it, what it's like now, but I think that it's worse. I mean, everything that I hear suggests it's worse.
Yeah. I mean, as this court, there's certain limits, even with, the lifetime tenure, that when you run up against the popular will and you're just smashing up against it, it creates all kinds of tension and legitimacy issues in our society for those folks. And I feel like they live in this sort of untouchable realm, especially since there's no oversight in terms of, gift receiving and, potential bribery. All that's coming to light in large part, I think, because the decisions are so unpopular.
Yeah, I think that the unpopular decisions have motivated people to look more closely at the court. And then you're finding a lot of pretty bad stuff, honestly.
Yeah.
I always sort of thought wow, you get to be on the Supreme Court and exercising this incredibly important power and deciding these really important cases, and that's your reward. And of course, you don't make as much money as you would as a partner at a law firm. And I think probably people maybe start out feeling that way. But I do think they're on the court for so long and they're there and they're looking around and they're like, gosh, everyone respects me so much. I could be making millions and millions of dollars at a law firm. Maybe I deserve to go on this super fancy vacation because that's the kind of person I am. And I think probably that kind of perspective is difficult to resist after you've been on the court for 20 years, because everyone's telling you how important you are and you just feel like you deserve it.
You said something in one of the books, and I want to quote again. Maybe I said it earlier already. I'm blanking. When you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And as someone with your own incredible legacy, and there you are in an Ivy League school, and a lot of people want to go to Harvard and Yale and Penn, undergrad and graduate. I'm just saying, how does two questions. One, are there some creative workarounds so that equity can still persist despite this recent decision? And just how do you process this as just an individual? Because, I mean, you're very comfortable with your identity and your name, but it is one of, like, you got your name's on friggin' Rushmore, and a lot of highways. And so I want to know how you just process all this stuff, because it seems like a big thing.
Yeah. Well, so there's two sort of separate questions there.
Right.
I guess one is like, what can schools do? And the answer is the decision as it's written leaves open a lot for schools. In that, if you have the money to have an admission staff that reads everyone's personal statement and makes decisions based on that, you can just put a question on your application, like, tell us about your diverse perspective on life and how it's been formed, right?
Right.
Right. What is your life in America like? Or, what is your life wherever you're from? And people will understand. Like, there's a whole lot that goes on now in college applications where students understand they're supposed to present certain aspects. And it could very well go like, people understand now I'm supposed to write about my race. And they write about how their perspective has been informed by their race. And the admissions officers look at that and they're like, oh, we'd like a diverse set of perspectives. Here are people whose perspectives are different. And it just so happens that those are also members of certain racial groups. They could do that. And technically that's in compliance with the decision because they're not looking at race for its own sake. They'll get sued probably. So, if they start doing that and the numbers don't change, they'll get sued again. And I don't know what's going to happen with that.
In other words, the admissions people would be, or the university would be sued because I'm writing this article, writing my essay saying, well, I grew up, in a disadvantaged background and, I'm Black and I learned to navigate all this. And then that's a compelling essay and I get in. That could provoke another loss.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. If that happens and the numbers, the minority representation stays the same, absolutely sure they'll get sued. I don't know if they would lose. I think it would be hard to prove that they were doing anything wrong, according to what the Supreme Court has said. But I don't think that the goal of the anti-affirmative action people is to keep the student body the same, but just not have it done through explicit consideration of race. I don't think they would be satisfied with that.
And then your own personal story, because it's,
Well, yeah, so then my own personal story, I think that in some ways, growing up and having people react to me and treat me differently based on things that I know very well have nothing to do with me,
right,
did sort of make me more sensitive to the fact that we've got all of these status hierarchies in society that don't correspond to anything real.
Because I feel like it's sensitized you. It could have a couple of effects on people depending on who they are. It can make them build a wall and retreat into the fortress of whatever their gated world is, or it could sensitize them to the misfortune of others. And even, what I read about Theodore, he, as a son of privilege, in the years after the Civil War, was very interested in the tenement housing and the issues of poverty in New York City, So I guess it's not predetermined, although people make assumptions.
Right. No, so I think you're exactly right. Like, there are two ways that you can react to that, really. And one is to be like, this is who I am and I deserve it, and everyone deserves where they end up, and society is fundamentally fair, and the status quo is right, and we shouldn't question it or disrupt it. Or you could be like, a lot of this has nothing to do with who I am. And it seems kind of arbitrary. And we should look around and see if opportunity is distributed in an arbitrary way, because that's not really fair. And maybe we should try to improve that.
And you used a very important word, and that's fair. And I don't care what your level of legal scholarship is. People, even children in the playground, in the sandbox, sense what's fair and what's not. And if somebody has more toys than another, it's not fair. And I feel like that should be kind of our guiding principle. We sense what's fair. We sense when we've been ripped off. As a matter of fact, I just saw an email come across my screen, which probably means I am now technically on strike as an actor in Hollywood.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I unless the email, I didn't open it unless it says we settled, but I think we're on strike. But people have a sense of what's fair, and I feel like all these amendments and this thing is we're just trying to make the world a little more fair. And if it's a fair world, and I'm born of privilege, which I am also, middle class, whatever, I know I'm born into a certain amount of privilege. But if the world's fair, then I have an easier time dealing with my own self-worth. If I know that whatever I achieved was my achievement, it wasn't stolen from me or handed to me. And so, I mean, those are just powerful themes that I felt as a young person, and I still do, actually. And, it sounds like you're echoing those.
Yeah. And I think affirmative action is an interesting context in which to think about that, because it presents a bunch of different questions about fairness and a bunch of different dimensions. So, one of the attacks on affirmative action is it's unfair to treat people differently because of their race, which I think is true.
Yeah.
Race is not a morally relevant characteristic. But then the question is, well, one, are we doing it because we're trying to make society more fair generally? Right, if you think about it in terms of groups rather than individuals, and I think that is true, right? We've got these enormous wealth gaps, enormous racial wealth gaps, and affirmative action probably helps with that. It's maybe not the best way. It's not a perfect implementation of a goal of fairness, but I think it moves us forward. But then the other thing is, if you're talking about how unfair it is to give some people preferences based on their skin color, it raises the question, sure, that's unfair, but like unfair compared to what? Is it unfair compared to giving preferences to athletes? Well, maybe, because like if you're an athlete, you've worked to develop a skill, and that really is something about you. Is it unfair compared to giving preferences to children of faculty members or children of people who went to that school, like legacy preferences? And there I'm like, you know what? I think the legacy preference is actually less fair. Is it unfair compared to giving preferences to children of major donors? No, giving preference to people who buy their way in is much worse, I think. And then you've got things like geography, which, a lot of these preferences tend to have racial effects also. So you're like, we give preferences to people from sparsely populated states because we don't get a lot of North Dakotans at Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
That tends to favor whites. So I think, you need to look at the big picture.
So the goal is a fair world, and the path is through restorative justice. And when we try to repair the damages of the past, sometimes it creates either the appearance or the reality of new injustices, at least as processed by individuals. So it just seems like there's just a lot of grayscale out there. And we do the best.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court doesn't deal very well with that.
No. I read the minority opinion, I forget of whose, with respect to affirmative action, or I scanned it, and I thought it was brilliantly articulate of the core, how it subverts the intent of, for example, this equal protection clause, which was just make things more fair. And if
absolutely
goal in mind, it's not a cudgel to make things less fair.
Yeah, it's not supposed to stop the government from trying to promote racial equality. That's just crazy.
Right. Well, all of this is so interesting. I asked you this question a long time ago. We talked about our founding fathers, and those original, the Washingtons and the Jeffersons. But maybe we need to embrace a new group of founding fathers. And I always like to just play a name game with you about who those might be, um, and maybe mothers too, Harriet Tubman and people like that. But I'll name some. Frederick Douglass to me is like top dog.
Yeah, yeah. So the whole thing that you're saying, like, I totally agree with. One of the things that I thought was so interesting about the affirmative action opinions was that both the majority and the dissent keep talking about the second founding.
Right.
So they are talking more about Reconstruction as a real inflection point in American history. Now, they're still doing this standard thing where they're like, oh, the second founding is what really gives us the values of the Declaration of Independence. And I think that's totally wrong. But they're giving more significance to Reconstruction and the Civil War. And I like that. And what I think we need to do is like just shift our focus about the origins of America from 1776 to more like 1863, 1868, Gettysburg Address, 14th Amendment. And one of the ways that we could do that, I'm getting back to what you said now, is like put this out there in popular culture. So what made the founding like really popular recently and got everyone all excited? Hamilton, the musical Hamilton,
Right.
takes one of the founding fathers and is like, here's the story of America and American ideals told in a moving way, with great hip hop music through the life of Alexander Hamilton. We need to do that for Reconstruction. Frederick Douglass. I think we should do it with Frederick Douglass. So a musical based on Frederick Douglass. And I looked this up, and actually there is a musical based on the life of Frederick Douglass, I think. But they probably don't have Lin-Manuel Miranda doing it.
Well,
so we need to get him on it.
I would say with Lincoln and Douglas, the Lincoln-Douglas, not debate, but Frederick Douglass to me is the most incredible person of the 19th century. I mean, just his journey, the world that he prophesied, the possibility of a multicultural democracy, his July 4th speech before the Civil War.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you talk about a founding father. I mean, this guy is really his most hopeful vision of the world, looking over this horizon and then coming from where he came. And I feel, because I deal in movies, I've written 10, I've made one. Okay.
All right, write us a Frederick Douglass movie.
Oh God, we'll get Blight or what's his name? Blight or Bright?
Yes, David Blight. Yes, I've talked to him. Yeah, he's great. He's great. Yeah,
he's great. He totally feels it. And I'm friends with I did a podcast with him with your great. He's great grandson of Frederick Douglass. And ironically, he's also the great grandson of Booker T. Washington, because those families merged.
Oh, wow.
And we did and he's part of, like, blanking on the name, but he's a great guy. And he's trying to put together a Frederick Douglass movie, because I feel like his life's been unexamined in movies. And he's his journey is so spectacular.
Yeah. It's absolutely.
So incredible.
Yeah, Frederick Douglass is amazing.
Yeah. Kermit, I love this. You're so cool. And I want to just remind people, this guy writes some really cool books. And the most recent one is the one the one, the
Nation That Never Was.
The Nation. Yeah, The Nation. I'm sure there's something else. Are you more inclined towards the novel or the more interpretive, sort of historical true story pieces?
Well, I go back and forth. I kind of want to write a novel next. I want to write a fantasy novel.
Okay. Get out of the courtroom, get out of the law firms and stuff like that.
Yeah. Get back to the vampires.
Get back to the vampire. Okay, your true milieu. I could never have been a lawyer because I hated those shoes. They're so hard on the bottom. And then you go into a courtroom and the floors are so hard. It's like you got to wear these hard shoes and these hard floors, and it just hurts. And I don't know how anybody does it. And congratulations, you did it. My best friend is an assistant
Yeah,
U.S.
for a
attorney.
while.
Yeah, downtown. But now you're in the T-shirt, so you're cool. Well,
Right.
Kermit, I want to thank you. I mean, I'm doubly charmed that you would agree to talk to me twice. It's so cool. And thank God for our technology, because it's allowed me to expand my life in so many cool ways. And just thanks for sharing your thoughts in this calamitous but maybe hopeful moment. I feel it. I just say this as a last thought, and you can echo it, is that when the Supreme Court makes these kind of harsh decisions, it inspires creative workarounds from the public. So I saw this morning where, with respect to the abortion that decision, an abortion pill was made accessible over the counter.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean the decision is not good, but it does mean that there's a little bit of a workaround that wasn't there before.
Yeah, although they'll still prosecute you for that. I mean, it's maybe easier not to get caught, but
Yeah. Huh. Well, we'll see what happens, man.
yeah.
Thanks so much for your thoughts. Have a groovy summer. I'll be in touch. And
All right.
folks, thanks so much for joining myself and Kermit Roosevelt. Till next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean namaste, aloha. See ya.